All right. Good evening or good night to those of you wherever you are logging in from. Thank you for joining us again. And if you are new to the lecture, we welcome you today. This is part two of our three-part series. We'll be reconvening again next Thursday. But for this Thursday, this is Resetting the Table for Common Purpose Conversations. And we are going to be dissecting different understandings of truth. So we live in an environment that is information heavy, and not all of that information can be legitimate or is legitimate. And we're kind of going to take a deep dive into the historical, the historical misunderstandings of certain truths that have been perpetuated. So again, we're going to look at those, talk about that, and then for lecture series or lecture part three, we're going to be talking about building bridges of conversation. So definitely make sure you want to come back so you can join us for that one. And we're going to talk about today's agenda. So we are going to examine the historical backlashes throughout history. We're going to look at different information and misinformation or myths that have been perpetuated and have caused some of those historical backlashes, and then consider how we might respond to contemporary misinformation. And there is a note, or the overall takeaway is that power creates knowledge that reinforces power. And shout out to Dr. Geary for that. And a quick note for clock hours, if you are a Washington State educator, and if you are an educator, period, and you're questioning, you have questions about, does this qualify for different clock hours, you can reach out to Luke, who is a team member and a part of the Educators for Democracy here through the Institute. All right. So to kind of situate ourselves, I'm not going to read all of these, and all of these definitions are brought to you by Merriam-Webster. But we really want to talk about those first three. We're going to talk about what is a myth, right? What is a myth? Well, an unfounded or false notion. That is just one of the very many definitions that they have underneath myth. But this one is really going to fit for what we're talking about today. And then the idea of power, right? The possession or control of something, the authority, the influence over. All right. And then obviously the theme of this is going to be backlashes. So this is going to be a sudden or violent movement backwards or a reaction. So we're going to talk about, we kind of situated ourselves last lecture. We talked about the different things that we saw, the different ways that these multiracial coalitions came together against these instances of power. And now we're going to talk about the backlash, or what was the reaction to that forward momentum. And then you can see the rest of those. All right. So backlashes to multiracial coalitions. So we're going to jump right in. So last time we talked about Bacon's Rebellion, right? You had poor white farmers, you had enslaved and some free Black folk that were down south in Virginia in 1676 who came together, and they had a little bit of an uprising, all right? And for the most part, it had been the first time in those new colonial settings that something like this happened. Well, what ended up being the backlash to this? People were upset. How dare you? Okay, the question is, how dare you exercise whatever they thought was not your right? So the backlash to this accelerated the use of African slavery as a permanent labor source, which ended large-scale indentured servitude. So again, you had enslaved people who were mandated to work, right? That was how the United States operated. In this instance, though, it's going to end large-scale servitude. So those poorer white farmers are going to lose their opportunities because they're going to put more African and African Americans in these positions to work for free labor rather than those poor white farmers. This is also going to codify race into law and establish this racial hierarchy to really convince people like, hey, I know you might be upset at your life circumstance, but at least you are not enslaved. At least you are not a slave. All right. Kind of furthering this divide between these two people that were coming together for a common cause, right? They had came together for a specific cause, which was labor, right? They were uniting around labor that transcended race. But now we have this codified into law where people kind of see themselves differently because that's how the government was working. And then what happens, right? As a consequence, this is a lost opportunity. This is a deep lost opportunity for people who could have stayed together, right? Imagine what would have happened if this coalition was not broken up because of these things. However, it is the ruling class that ends up rewriting those rules. They are going to divide them by race instead of uniting them by the struggle. Think about the commonalities that we share because of the struggle and how they were disbanded. All right. And what was the myth or the misinformation that we're talking about? It's the devaluing of the Black body. And this is years and years old prior to this 1676. Going all the way back to the Magna Carta, the idea that Black people, per their skin color, were less than, people trace that back and make biblical assumptions, or they try to use that as their justification that the Black body is not as valuable, and therefore this is going to lay the foundation for what we see to come for racial struggles and racial issues in the United States. So we talked about Jefferson and his thoughts, right? He omitted a passage, he left out a passage. The founding fathers were like, hey, we can't do that. We cannot talk about slavery in our Declaration of Independence. Jefferson was very clear that this is something that cannot last. However, our Constitution is created 1787 and then is ratified in 1789. However, the Three-Fifths Compromise, the first proposal for population and voting was that 5 citizens equals 5 votes and 5 enslaved people equals 5 votes. Sounds fair because it is fair. Proposal 2 was that if you're a citizen, you get 5 votes, and we shouldn't count the enslaved population for votes at all. And some sort of genius, whether that be evil genius or not, they had some sort of calculation worked out where they determined that counting at least 3 out of every 5, or if you have 5 people, at least 3 of those count for a vote. Okay. So this is enshrined in our Constitution, right? At our founding, at our very base of our country. So in terms of representation, right, it is going to bolster the South's opportunity to have more representation in Congress. Now, we have a lot going on in today's climate about Congress and what representation looks like in voting, but these conversations are not new. It just had to do with the human body. All right. And what is the myth? What is the misinformation? Is that enslaved bodies not counting as people, but population? How can we honestly make that assumption? How can we make that conclusion that these people who are working, who are laying the foundation of our country with blood, sweat, and tears, how can we make that assumption and yet not give them or count them as people, but we count them towards the population, right? Racism is hard to comprehend because it just doesn't make sense. Okay. It just doesn't make sense on its face. So then moving forward, okay, Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution, and then we have the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. This is one of the popular images in terms of enslaved people running away. To be a fugitive slave, right? I am leaving this place. I no longer want to deal with this section or this situation of life. All right. But this act and these laws give enslavers their own legal right to recapture an enslaved person going across state lines, right? We talk about the importance of states' rights. States' rights right now is a very popular topic. It is a very controversial topic, if you will. However, you are going to have officials that were required to assist in the capturing of these runaways. And these acts and this law is going to allow the enslavers to either present proof to reclaim and sometimes even do so without it, right? There were multiple instances documented in history where you have free people or people who have had their freedom papers, and all it took was in a slave catcher or the enslaver to say, actually, no, because how is that going to stand up in court? Okay. And what is the myth in this situation? Unfortunately, there were people that perpetuated this narrative that people running away, these enslaved people who were running away, must have had something wrong with them, that they were mentally ill or there was something that was not right. Okay. I can't imagine how that stood up in terms of common sense, right? Who would want to live their life in bondage, being whipped and shackled and chained and, not having the ability to take care of their own selves and working from sun up to sundown, right? The idea that somebody would want to go through that. And then the idea that slavery was necessary for African and African Americans in terms of their civilization. They have to go through this process of enslavement so that they can understand the way of the world because of their savagery. And it's the same kind of things that they used against the natives, the indigenous people to this land when they were colonizing and initially laid the ground for what we see to come in the late 16 and 1700s as a result of enslavement. All right. So again, talking about the backlash, right? The backlash of people saying, hey, this is not going to last. Jefferson said this is not going to last. This is not going to be good. But yet there were laws that were enshrined in our Constitution on the books to maintain the institution of slavery. And then we talked about Gabriel's Rebellion, okay, one of the largest uprisings in the state of Virginia, where they had planned to kidnap the governor, James Monroe, future president. Harsher laws are going to be passed that are much, much more strict in Virginia, okay? The idea is that we will never have another uprising like this again, so we're going to put it on the books to show you so. All right. And then you have for both free and enslaved Black people. Okay. And Jefferson warned about the excessive punishment. You had multiple people that were hanged in this instance, right? On the public display, we're going to kill these people, right? We're going to take these people and set them as an example for the public to know that you will not do this again. And yet again, we have who I won't call him an abolitionist, but there was something about Thomas Jefferson that knew, and maybe it was his conscience, right? Is the duality of Thomas Jefferson, but he warned against excessive punishment because he feared the condemnation from other states and the world, right? Virginia is going to be the citadel for everything to kind of start. That is where American democracy is born out of. And he warned that eyes are on us, and we might not want to do that. He says that there's a strong sentiment that there has been hanging enough. If only the people in the 60s, in the 1950s and 40s were listening to the president at the time. He says the other states in the world at large will forever condemn us if we indulge in a principle of revenge. And that revenge was the backlash to the rebellion. So he warned that us taking this type of action against people seeking freedom is not going to bode well for us. And what is the myth? That slavery was the rightful place of the Negro and it was biblically acceptable. They had their reasons and they were willing to show and do everything that they could to keep that system going. And we see that last into the 1860s, right? Which takes us to John Brown. Okay, remember that image that we see. Now, this is the most ironic and maybe the echoes, the rhymes of history kind of shine through today. Harper's Ferry happens, right? John Brown gets a multiracial coalition together, free African Americans, enslaved African Americans, his own sons, and a couple college students. They get together, they go to that army base to seize those weapons and pass them out, and they are ready to take action because he said it is the divine that is speaking through me that says that this is no longer acceptable, and I'm willing to die for it. The backlash is that this is going to be stopped by U.S. Marines who were led by future Confederate general just a couple years later, Robert E. Lee, right? The Robert E. Lee statues that have been toppled and the mentioning of the Confederacy and how that's kind of coming up in today's climate in 2025, right? Well, Robert E. Lee is a part of this initial backlash to someone who is a white guy that is very determined to end the institution of slavery. Brown then was hanged, but he became a martyr for the North. Okay. His story was something that people admired because he was willing and did lay it out all on the line in the name of what's right. And remember, at the end of our lecture last week, I told you all, what if everybody had a little bit of John Brown spirit in them? Evil cannot withstand the righteousness of people just making the good decision, the right decision for humanity, right? This is going to deepen the national divide and push the United States towards the Civil War, which happens just 2 years later in 1861. Okay, now these are his own words. I came here from Kansas, and this is a slave state. I want to free all the Negroes in this state. I have possession now of the United States Armory, and if the citizens interfere with me, I must only burn the town and have blood. He made his cause and his case very clear. I am not going to stand for this, and everybody should be free. Everybody should be free. Just think about that. In the 1850s, this man had every right to enjoy the life that he could have lived. He didn't have to be an activist. He didn't have to get into this fight. He didn't have to do any of that. But there was something inside of him that said, this is not right, and I am willing to die for it. I'm not asking anybody to put their lives on the line in the sense of John Brown, but I will always challenge you, your community, anybody that you know. When you hear something that's not right, what would John Brown do? To put your kids in a situation like that, I'm sure he loved his children, but again, he felt that righteousness cause. Now, this is Frederick Douglass, born enslaved, became a very well-known author, one of the most photographed guys in the world. Fun fact, he never really smiled in his pictures because he never wanted people to think that he had ever reached a sense of content or happiness with the life that he lived, okay? Now, this is 1881, all right? This is years after the Civil War has concluded, and this is a depiction of John Brown. This is what you see, a speech that Frederick Douglass created or that he gave in the name of John Brown. He said, did John Brown fail? John Brown began the war that ended American slavery and made this a free republic, all right? Giving people like Frederick Douglass the opportunity to be able to go on and live his life. His zeal in the cause of my race was far greater than mine. I could live for the slave, but he could die for them. Again, this is years after John Brown has been killed, right? This is years after the attempt to, rebel again in Virginia did not happen. But that spirit is always, always, always going to be there. All right. Now, in the 1880s, you're going to start to see the aftermath of the Civil War. And during those 1880s is going to be the introduction of these black codes, and they later become Jim Crow laws that follow after that. So again, what is it that John Brown stood for? What is the cause that he was willing to fight for? And what can we do to embody just a piece of that? Because again, I do not believe that the evil that we have seen in the peaks of the things that we see now, I don't think that can last, because there will be, I'm going to speak that into existence, there will be enough of us that say, you know what, if John Brown could do that, I can do a little bit of this. And with that, I will pass it over to you, Dr. Geary.
Thanks, Ivory. And I want to just echo what you're saying about John Brown and having a spirit of John Brown in us. And today is really about talking about truth about history, a history that is currently trying to be erased, or that people are trying to erase, and the narratives throughout history, the misinformation, the myth-information that people perpetuated in order to rationalize inequality and injustice. And in having that spirit of John Brown today, what we ask of ourselves and what we ask of you is, when you hear someone reiterating these myths that are historically embedded and historically enduring, as we're seeing and will continue to see, to interrupt that and to speak back to that. And next week, we'll talk about some of the methods of doing that in ways that can be better received by the person who is perpetuating the myth. But this is a call to be the ones who speak up against the misinformation, the so prevalent misinformation in our contemporary world today. All right, you can move me. And I'm actually going to be backing this up a little bit.
Very, very, very well said. That was awesome.
Thanks, Ivory.
Absolutely.
All right, so Ivory finished this in 1881. I'm going to back us up a little bit to the Civil War. And just to provide, so last week when I started speaking, I talked about the interracial abolitionist movement from 1830 to 1870. And I want to talk about the backlash to abolition and the emancipation of enslaved African Americans. So to provide just a quick timeline, as Ivory said, the Civil War begins in 1861. In 1863, we have Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation that becomes law and that declares the freedom of enslaved people in the Confederate States. But contrary to what many people believe, it did not mean the immediate freedom for those enslaved. Enslavers were not going to the folks that they had enslaved and telling them that the Emancipation Proclamation was law and that they were now free. So many African Americans who heard about the Emancipation Proclamation freed themselves by running away, but the process of freedom took years, and it took years. So in 1864, Lincoln ensures that the 13th Amendment is passed, and this is constitutionally abolishing slavery. And when it is ratified in 1865, Confederate states are required to ratify it to be admitted to the Union, though there's a lot of pushback there. Lincoln is assassinated in 1865 by John Wilkes Booth, but before his assassination, he establishes the Freedmen's Bureaus. And these were offices set up across the South to help transition Black people into freedom by providing food, clothes, shelter. And these Freedmen Bureaus offices had hundreds of schools. So this was arguably providing what it should have been seen as the bare minimum to support those who were newly freed, but there was major opposition to that support, as you can see in this newspaper clipping. There was vehement opposition. You see this racist caricature of a Black man. And at the bottom, in small text, it talks about how much the support is costing taxpayers. It's not saying anything about the massive amounts of wealth generated by centuries of enslavement, but it's perpetuating this myth of Black laziness and idleness after centuries of enslavement and working for white people. These are the myths that are immediately perpetuated. And this is even though some white people were asked, straight up asked, if they would begin doing the work that they had been enforcing enslaved people to do on their plantations, and many just scoffed at the idea. So it's this myth is the complete backwards of reality and who was being idle and who was being lazy during that time. It also perpetuates the myth that gains for African Americans necessarily mean losses for white people. So as you can see at the top, it says an urgency to keep the Negro in idleness at the expense of the white man. So this zero-sum racial thinking, as if there is some fixed amount of opportunity or rights to go around. All right, you can hit the next. So Andrew Johnson assumes the presidency in 1865, arguably one of, if not the worst president, in my opinion. And he puts into effect presidential reconstruction from 1865 to 1867. And this is reconstruction to rebuild the South physically in terms of the economy, in terms of the South's racial hierarchy. But it becomes very apparent that Johnson does not believe in racial integration. He does not believe in equality or justice for African Americans. And an example of this is a remark that he gives to the First District of Columbia's Colored Regiment. So about the Emancipation Proclamation made it, it allowed African Americans to sign up for the Union Army. And about 180,000 African Americans served in the Union military. That was 10% of the Union Army, with about an addition of around 20,000 African Americans in the Navy. And it seemed to many at the time that this heroism and sacrifice, in addition to enduring hundreds of years of horrors and unpaid labor, would surely grant African Americans equality in the eyes of the nation. But the year he takes office, we've got someone including my, oh, wow. Oh, including my, can you share what you're saying there, Ivory?
When you talk about the African Americans that enlisted after this, like during the Civil War, my great grandfather was a part of that.
Whoa. Whoa. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. So the year he takes office, Johnson addresses this regiment. And at first he thanks them for their service, and you can find this online, his speech to them. And then he tells them this. He says, freedom is not simply the privilege to live in idleness. Liberty does not mean simply to resort to the low saloons and other places of disreputable character. Freedom and liberty do not mean that the people ought to live in licentiousness, which means live immorally with disregard for the rules. I had to look it up. But liberty means simply to be industrious, to be virtuous, to be upright in all of our dealings and relations with men, and those now before me. I have to say that a great deal depends upon yourselves. You must give evidence. You must give evidence that you are competent for the rights that the government has guaranteed to you. So he is illustrating white society's just heinously hypocritical categorization of African Americans as immoral and lazy, as we saw in that newspaper clipping from the Freedmen Bureau, about the Freedmen Bureau. And as Ivory said, as the war ends, Confederate states, starting with Mississippi, institute black codes to criminalize blackness, to control and oppress African Americans, and to keep them bound to white plantations, criminalizing any attempt by Black men and women to break free from their servitude to white people. So it was a blatant attempt of Southern states to make, as Du Bois said, African Americans slaves in everything but name. And under the Black codes, Black people can't sue white people, they can't vote, they can't serve on a jury, and on and on and on. And whites utilize this myth of Black idleness to rationalize forcing African Americans to sign labor contracts. And if they were refused, they were sold into convict leasing, slavery by another name. After signing contracts, African Americans were forbidden from seeking work from a different employer, no matter how inhumane working conditions were. And Frederick Douglass and others went to the White House and met with Johnson. And they later wrote to Johnson and they asked him how he could allow for these Black codes to continue for a people whom you have repeatedly declared your purpose to maintain in freedom. And a Philadelphia newspaper said that these codes were necessary, that the Southern states, quote, just wanted to stop vagrancy and put an end to the undeniable evils of idleness and pauperism arising from the sudden emancipation of so many slaves. The hypocrisy of this, to use the Black codes to block African Americans from self-sufficiency by denying them so many rights, access to land, banning them from hunting and fishing, forbidding them from working independently using skills that they had developed while enslaved, like blacksmithing, and yet saying to them that they were idle and lazy. So you can go on to the next. Johnson actually vetoes, this is just kind of on top of that, just this force of white supremacy, just not allowing any support for African Americans who are newly freed. So Johnson vetoes the Freedmen's Bureau bill to extend its life, so to continue on those offices, the schools. He tries to stop that agency from providing critical support. Luckily, this is overridden by Congress. But he writes that the US government has never founded schools for any class of our own people. It has never deemed itself authorized to expand the public money for the rent or purchase of homes for the thousands, not to say millions, of the white race who are honestly toiling from day to day for their subsistence. It was never intended that the newly emancipated should henceforth be fed, clothed, educated, and sheltered by the United States. The idea in which the slaves were assisted to freedom was that on becoming free, they would be a self-sustaining population. It is earnestly hoped that instead of wasting away, they will be, by their own efforts, they will establish for themselves a condition of respectability and prosperity. It is certain that they can attain to that condition only through their own merits and exertions. I want to point out two myths that are very prevalent and explicit in this discourse, and that we hear today. The first is the bootstrap myth. I'm sure you're familiar with this belief that anyone can achieve success purely through hard work and determination, regardless of systemic barriers. So he's saying that whites progressed without government help, which was a lie, and we'll touch on that in a moment. But because of that, Black people should be able to equally progress without help as well, despite facing numerous obstacles that white people never faced. The other myth is meritocracy, the belief that success is purely the result of hard work and talent, ignoring how race, privilege, and systemic barriers affect opportunity. And these are myths that were perpetuated immediately after emancipation. And so you know that hundreds of years later, people are using them, in addition to many others that we'll touch on. Johnson rescinded, oh, sorry, stay back for just a second. He rescinded the original wartime promise of 40 acres to newly freed families. You hear about 40 acres and a mule. He rescinded that. Instead, most of the land was given back to former plantation and slave owners, which basically forced African Americans into sharecropping. Yet, he champions the Homestead Act, which between 1860 and the 1930s provided roughly 270 million acres of land, much of which had been Native American territory, to some 1.5 million homesteading white families. So when he says that the government's not helping white people, it's a blatant lie. Okay, on to the next. He also tries to veto the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And again, this is overridden by Congress. But the Civil Rights Act of 1866, it was meant to nullify the Black codes by declaring all people born in the US to be citizens and granting them civil rights protections. This essentially becomes later on the 14th Amendment in 1868. But in his veto, Johnson says that African Americans aren't qualified to be citizens, and that the components of the Civil Rights Act established for the security of the colored race safeguards which go infinitely beyond any that which the general government has ever provided for the white race. In fact, the distinction of race and colors is by the bill made to operate in favor of the colored and against the white race. So again, this myth of reverse discrimination, reverse racism. So we don't have time to talk about the period of radical Reconstruction that follows this. It's also called military Reconstruction, congressional Reconstruction, and this is essentially when Congress continues to take power from Johnson, and we have this period of Black political power and just critical civil rights legislation that's passed. Of course, this is followed by an immense backlash of racial violence. If you're interested in learning more about that history, we really recommend that you sign up for a course with Dr. Terry Ann Scott, the Institute director. You can also check out the podcast that she and Uhuru Williams, Dr. Uhuru Williams, did yesterday. They talk about radical Reconstruction and the backlash. Okay, but now we're going to jump forward. So after talking about abolition last week, I talked about the Wobblies, who were around during 1910, the industrial workers of the world, and how the Wobblies were constituted predominantly of African Americans because of the Great Migration. So I want to talk about the backlash to this northern migration. So we often hear the myth that slavery was so long ago, so Black people should have equal opportunities now. And we hear that the South is so backwards and the North is so progressive. And these are both, I think, often perpetuated by people who aren't fully aware of our true history, the history of racism in the North, the incredible obstacles that African Americans have faced in every decade and every region of the United States in which they've resided. And so I just want to briefly, I'm sure some of you are familiar with these, but I just want to briefly touch on redlining and the GI Bill. So from roughly 1910 onward, millions of African Americans migrated from the Jim Crow South to northern and western cities because of economic opportunity and also to escape the Jim Crow South and the racial violence that had erupted as a backlash to radical Reconstruction. But when they came to the North, they were met with a different but very, very potent racism, including segregation, stringent segregation, and discrimination in housing, education, employment, as well as they faced police brutality. So a couple major times that the racial wealth gap was multiplied by many times over, was in the 1930s and 1940s. In the 1930s, FDR's New Deal massively expanded homeownership opportunities for white Americans by making mortgages and loans more accessible to them. But the Federal Housing Administration, the FDA, FHA, used redlining and denied loans and mortgages to Black Americans, Latino and Hispanic communities, and other marginalized groups. So, in other words, the government heavily invested in whites and white neighborhoods and divested in marginalized communities and kept the two separate, which expanded the wealth gap immensely. And then in the 1940s, the GI Bill was built on New Deal housing models and provided World War II veterans with low interest government backed home loans. But Black vets faced major barriers when trying to access these benefits, as white run financial institutions refused to grant them mortgages and loans. So, to give you some numbers, only 0.7% of 1.3 million Black veterans were successful in getting home loans under the GI Bill. 0.7% of 1.3 million. And between 1934 and 1962, Black Americans received just 2% of the 120 billion in housing financed by government agencies. 2%. So the New Deal and the GI Bill helped create a booming white middle class and white multi-generational wealth, and African Americans were essentially shut out from that. And we still see the repercussions of this. In many ways, one being the housing market, which is still biased against Black people. And in 2023, Black home ownership was at 45% and white home ownership was at 73%. All right, we're gonna jump. I know we're jumping, but if we want to cover kind of all periods of time and talk about these backlashes, we've got to do that. So we're gonna jump to the 1960s. Last week, I talked about the Civil Rights Movement. I talked about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I talked about Black Power and the Black Panther Party. There was immense backlash against all of this, and immense backlash to the civil rights legislation put forward by LBJ's administration. So Nixon believed that the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act raised unrealistic expectations in the Black community, and he fear-mongered towards whites by saying that if equality didn't immediately materialize, lawlessness and rioting would follow. And of course, this is despite a principle of the civil rights movement being nonviolence, and a principle of the Black Panther Party and the Rainbow Coalition being violence, but in self-defense. So Nixon uses the Southern strategy to get elected. And this is a strategy to increase political support from white voters by appealing to their racism, using coded messages and phrases that appear neutral on the surface, but carry racially charged meanings. These are called racial dog whistles, like saying law and order and inner city. There's a book on this, Dog Whistle Politics, and we're planning to send out a resource list at some point, and I'll include that book. Trump uses these terms today, but he also uses a strategy I'd call megaphone racism, which is much more explicit. But at this time, it wasn't socially acceptable to be as explicit in racism. So I want to play Nixon's one of his campaign ads. I don't think we're getting sound yet. Still no sound. This is the trickiest part of what we do. I swear. Oh, there we go.
This country has grown 9 times as fast as population. At the current rate, the crimes of violence in America will double by 1972. We cannot accept that kind of future for America. We owe it to the decent and law-abiding citizens of America to take the offensive against the criminal forces that threaten their peace and their security, and to rebuild respect for law across this country. I pledge to you, the wave of crime is not going to be the wave of the future in America.
So Nixon puts out a slew of ads like this, and often the ads carefully avoid using pictures of African Americans, but still conflate crime and blackness, tapping into white anxieties about Black protests, crime, and urban unrest. After seeing this ad, Nixon reportedly said that it, quote, hit it right on the nose. It's all about those damn Negro Puerto Rican groups out there. So he's specifically, very explicitly behind the scenes, but more implicitly in front of the scenes, is playing off the myth that African Americans and other marginalized groups are inherently more violent than white people. And we see that today with Trump and the targeting of cities run by Black mayors. So the first civil rights legislation Nixon sends to Congress proposes eliminating the section of the Voting Rights Act requiring the Department of Justice to approve any changes that states make to their election laws if those states had shown a history of discrimination towards Black voters. For just a few examples, if states had literacy tests, poll taxes, voter intimidation, on and on. Nixon said that this unfairly singled out Southern states, and he proposed instead that the Justice Department should have to approve all states' changes to their voting rights. The Attorney General said what Nixon likely knew, which was that this would lead to the Voting Rights Act not actually being able to be enforceable because the Department of Justice would be overwhelmed. It would be impossible to screen every voting change in every state in the nation. So his suggestion was not taken into account. But one example of how critically essential every element of the Voting Rights Act was is in 1964, prior to passing, only roughly 10% of Black adults were registered to vote in Mississippi. But after the act went into effect, registration skyrocketed to 60% in 1968. And these challenges by Nixon, by Reagan, by others against the Voting Rights Act were the seeds that led to the U.S. Supreme Court's 2013 decision in Shelby County, Alabama versus Holder, which eviscerated the law. And justices in 2013 said that the law had served its purpose and was no longer needed. That's perpetuating a myth of post-racialism, that our nation has moved on beyond racial prejudice. And this was especially popular, that myth was especially popular during Obama's election. I'm sure you heard it. I forgot to mention that in 1965, Nixon says almost every legislative roadblock to equality of opportunity for education, jobs, and voting had been removed. Again, playing off this idea of post-racialism, that we've solved the problems, so forget about the discrimination in our past, let's move on. So often politicians want to do that to preserve power while peddling with racism. The 2016 election was the first election, federal election in 50 years without the Voting Rights Act. And voting ID laws purged voting rolls, redrawn district boundaries, closed and moving polling places, and so many more disenfranchisement strategies evaporated millions of votes. So these myths, this misinformation has real consequences for our democracy and for our livelihoods. If you go on to the next, I want to name just a few of, again, just kind of reemphasize a few of the myths that I've said and some additional ones that I haven't touched on. So again and again, we hear that any support for marginalized people, minoritized people, is reverse racism or reverse discrimination. I have a quote here from Nixon: "Dividing Americans into quotas is totally alien to the American tradition. The way to end discrimination against some is not to begin discrimination against others." That's blatant reverse racism that he's saying happens there. In 1974, Alan Bakke, I'm not sure how to say his last name, filed a suit alleging affirmative action had cost him a spot in medical school. That's the individual on the right here. And he won in a Supreme Court case. And they ruled that he had been discriminated against. And they required that the school let him in. It was, I believe, I have this written down. I want to say the University of California Medical School. And they ask that the schools begin to, when they are looking at disadvantaged a disadvantage as kind of a marker, that they widen that when they're thinking about affirmative action, so that folks who are disadvantaged in many different ways, not just race, can be accepted under kind of that affirmative action marker. The Supreme Court, as you all know, reversed affirmative action in 2023. Again, I think believing that we no longer need these measures in place that are so necessary because of all of the history that we just talked about. Meritocracy is that other myth. Nixon said quotas are intended to be a shortcut to equal opportunity, but in reality, they are dangerous detours away from the traditional value of measuring a person on the basis of ability. And I'm pulling from Nixon because we're talking about that era, but I'm sure that we could find both of these myths from many presidents after Nixon. If you go on to the last one that I've got here, with Reagan, we see new myths, the same myths, colorblindness. It's better not to acknowledge race. He said, we want a colorblind society, a society that, in the words of Dr. King, judges people not by the color of their skins, but by the content of their character. The idea that racism is only extremism. Racism is not seen from everyday people, that it's only the actions of small groups like the Ku Klux Klan. He says a few isolated groups in the backwater of American life still hold perverted notions of what America is all about. Recently, in some places in the nation, there's been a disturbing recurrence of bigotry and violence. And by saying backwater of American life, again, kind of perpetuating the idea of the progressive North and the backward South. And then the last one, cultural deficit narrative, that marginalized groups are to blame for their plight. Reagan says there's no question that many well-intentioned programs have contributed to family breakups, welfare dependency, and a large increase in births out of wedlock. In the 1970s, the number of single mothers rose from 8 to 13% among whites, and from 31 to a tragic 47% among blacks. Too often, their children grow up poor, malnourished, and lacking in motivation. An echo to Andrew Johnson saying that when you help, when you provide support for these communities who have experienced oppression, that you are doing them a disservice, that it makes them weaker, which is a complete lie. All right, over to you, Ivory. Oh, I forgot we had these two guys. So we wanted to show you some contemporary examples of how these myths can sound when people hold these types of beliefs. So we'll leave it up to you to try and discern what myths each gentleman is perpetuating here. And this is part of the Whiteness Project, where they interviewed folks.
I don't see any myself personally of a race problem. I see a responsibility problem with people. When you don't support your own ethnicity from within your own communities, then you can't grow successful anyplace else. So I see that in the Black community, that they do not support each other. And when there's a problem, it's always somebody else's fault. And then they'll say, well, the white guy still holds all the cards. No. It ain't the white guy, it ain't the black guy, Spanish guy. There's a lot of people holding a good hand in this country. It's what you do with it that counts. You can't point at the white guy anymore and go, hey, you're the one who's holding me back for 200 years. It's impossible unless you hold yourself back. So that's the way I look at it. Everybody's an individual to me.
So just in those,
I don't,
however long that was, he managed to fit in the cultural deficit myth, the post-racialism myth, the myth of meritocracy, and the slavery is over myth.
Do I think it's beneficial for me to be white if I got any privileges like that? I would say no. Just plain and simple, no. I think that, with civil rights and everything, I think a lot of times that other minorities sometimes get more benefits than I would as being a white person. For some reason, some Black people kind of hold on to the back in the day, the slave thing, or they feel they're not being treated right. Should slavery be something that, because it happened, we owe Black people something more? Absolutely not. Like I said, it had nothing to do with me. It had nothing to do with Black people living today. Maybe their great, great, great grandmother went through it, someone they never met, but it's in the past. There's been injustices done forever in human existence. And it's just something that shouldn't happen. But it doesn't mean I owe anyone anything because of it. I think it's hard to talk about race as a white person because I feel like maybe sometimes Black people are just looking for a reason to tell you why you're wrong or tell you why you owe them something. If I was in a room full of white people, I would not feel uncomfortable talking about race. But if there were other minorities in that room, I might think a little bit different, and I might be a little bit more careful opening my mouth to not offend anyone or to potentially get in an argument or a heated debate.
I think a good rule of thumb that we can all agree on is if you are nervous about talking about race in a room with minoritized people, you need to examine your beliefs. All right.
I know. I feel, he says your great, great, great grandmother. And I'm like sitting here like, yeah, I may not have met the guy. But it was the injustices done to him that, he didn't have a leg up. He didn't have like everything that they got was either from sharecropping or, it's just, I don't know. It's very interesting. All right. So we are going to talk about.
I don't see any.
Not them anymore. Some backlashes toward President Obama, Black Lives Matter, and a diverse America. So if you remember last time we watched the video, okay, if you remember the video we watched, it talked about, or it highlighted the reaction of the multiracial coalition that came together, right? That came together in support of President Obama. And before I go any further, I do want to make note. Yes, we left off at Reagan, right? But that doesn't absolve Bush 1 from his continuation of some of Reagan's policies. It doesn't absolve President Clinton from the crime bill that was very destructive to the African-American community. It doesn't absolve Bush 2, especially with his lack of response with FEMA for the people down south in Katrina during 2005. If you have, there's a documentary going out, or that's out right now, about Katrina and how disadvantaged that population of African Americans were in New Orleans at that time, and the reasons why they couldn't necessarily get out. So none of the presidents to come after Reagan are necessarily absolved from that, but we would be here all day if we didn't. All right. So to talk about these contemporary backlash, or the backlashes toward Obama and Black Lives Matter. So these were some of the phrases that were given at the very end of that video. Okay, the election scares me. We might be headed towards a socialist nation for the first time. And these are actual words from people who were upset or that appeared to have some sort of not positive reaction to his election. For the first time in history of the U.S., we have someone that hangs out with terrorists that bombed the Pentagon in New York City and knows the people and hangs out at their houses. We could be a welfare state in 4 years. I'm the guy on record saying he is the Black Muslim Antichrist, right? These are some of the reactions that we saw during that video. However, I want to focus your attention to some of the imagery that is pretty horrid, right? It is very disturbing. It is very frustrating. The very first picture at the top left-hand side, you see a doll, two dolls being hung from what appears to be some sort of structure. But I direct your attention to the back. I don't know, and I can't say for certain that that is a church in the background, but that is definitely a cross, right? You got hanging there Obama with the idea of a noose there. Obama, where's your papers? You have a depiction of him in some other cultural garb when it comes to healthcare. This woman is holding a sign that says a village in Kenya is missing its idiot, deport Obama, right? And again, we're talking about the backlashes and the mythology behind a lot of this animosity towards progress, right? Progress for multiracial coalitions, but specifically you have African Americans facing this type of situation and this hostility. If people were willing to do this towards the president, imagine what life could have been and was like for African Americans during this time period where you see a rise of outwardness in terms of an election of somebody who did not say he was going to revitalize this country in the name of African Americans, but said that he was determined to be a good president for the United States of America. One of his famous lines was, "It's not about red states or blue states, it's about the United States," right? Because we all have to share this place. We're all here. So how do we move forward with that, with this type of imagery coming out from 2008 and thereon? You have more of a reaction, right? An old wound of racism was opened and it seems to be fully exposed in today's world, right? I saw this picture, I think this is from 2008-9. It says, "He had a dream, we got a nightmare," right? The dream was that one day somebody like President Obama could become president of the United States, which is ironic that they have that statement. It's pretty sad. But again, racism just doesn't make sense. Okay, you can't make sense of that. So the new demand now is for proof of qualifications, right? We have the birtherism. I believe that happened in 2011, where the current president now was speaking about he should show his birth certificate. There were questions about his legitimacy in terms of citizenship. And we see now that there's not just this demand for a birth certificate for a president who was an American president. And you see billboards that were erected, okay? President or jihad. It says birth certificate, prove it. Wake up, America. And then in that corner, it says, remember Fort Hood. And I believe John Bell Hood was a member of the Confederacy, a Confederate general, and maybe owned slaves. I'm not sure about that part, but he was a Confederate general. Now, what do we see the demand for qualifications for, right? Affirmative action in these DEI claims. I can't tell you how many times that I have been called a DEI hire for engaging with people on Facebook, not in the name of combat, but general concern or general yearning for factual conversation with people who might disagree with me. All right. So these are some of the very early stages of this backlash that we saw come out loud, right? I believe that Devin talked about how there was a little bit of a hush back then and it started to grow and grow. And now you see where we are. So I want to fast forward just a little bit to this image. I am hopeful that you all have seen this, but this was from 2017. Okay, this was a white nationalist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. This is going to take place at the statue of Robert E. Lee because this is the time period where people were like, hey, maybe we shouldn't have these Confederate monuments up. Maybe we should take these things down. Maybe these echoes and these rhymes of racism should not be out loud and allowed anymore. You had people from all over. There were a couple people from my hometown who were there that got identified. And this is a white nationalist rally. Now, a white nationalist is going to be somebody who believes in the ideas of what Manifest Destiny was. This land of America is our God-given right, and we have the sole, like we are in sole possession of this. This is our land. Our forefathers, our ancestry is what gave us this land. Negating the fact that natives were here, negating the fact that it was a lot of blood, sweat, and tears by not just African Americans who were enslaved, but think about the immigration population, those Asian Americans that were working on railroads, so on and so forth, right? This land is a culmination of diversity at work, right? Hard work, and not often rewarded or acknowledged. One of the things that this group was responsible for saying out loud, though, one of their chants was, "You will not replace us. You will not replace us." Okay. I want you to keep this image in your mind because this is also from 2000.
Had people that were very fine people on both sides. You had people in that group, excuse me, I saw the same pictures as you did. You had people in that group that were there to protest the taking down of, to them, a very, very important statue and the renaming of a park from Robert E. Lee to another name.
Now, I want to be very clear. As a social studies teacher, I believe in objectivity to the highest extent. Robert E. Lee was an excellent general pre-Confederacy and during the Confederacy. He was a great general. He was very skilled. That is indisputable. It is the cause in which he was fighting for. It was the ideals that they were perpetuating that become the problem, in the idolization of him as a figure representing a Confederacy, and the Confederacy represented a reminder of where African Americans should be in terms of their time in their place in the country. All right. Now, again, at that time, that was the president of the United States saying that there were very fine people on both sides. I showed you the image of the rally. I want to take a couple minutes for us to watch this video, and we'll link this video in the sorry about that. We'll link that video in the document that we send out for you all to watch. All right. This is going to be, remember we spoke about Trayvon Martin. Okay, Trayvon Martin is who kind of got me, it kind of woke me up in terms of where my place was as a young Black kid in high school, because again, he was just a few months, or just a month older than I was at that time where he was murdered. Okay, we talked about the ideas of Black Lives Matter coming together and standing up against police brutality against minoritized communities, especially during the late teens of the 2000s. I want to play just a few minutes of this. The language is pretty strong, all right? But I really want you to listen to the message that he is saying. And again, this is about historical backlashes. There's nothing, politics is involved in all of this because it's a part of our history. But this is a history that we are examining in terms of the response to progress in this nation because of the multiracial coalitions that were coming together that may have threatened the existing power structure in the United States.
Who drove how long to get here?
12 hours from our car. Been driving from north of the border, so.
Oh, you came down from Canadistan. If I was doing the radical agenda in Canada, I'd probably be arrested for it, right?
Yeah, well, in Canada, hurting people's feelings is basically illegal. I mean, it's not really criminal, but
unless they're white males.
So when did you get into, as you said, the racial stuff?
When the Trayvon Martin case happened, you know, Michael Brown and Tamir Rice and all these different things happen. Every single case, it's some little Black asshole behaving like a savage, and he gets himself in trouble. Shockingly enough, whatever problems I might have with my fellow white people, they generally are not inclined to such behavior, and you know, you got to kind of take that into consideration when you're thinking about how to organize your society.
In Oklahoma City.
Okay, so exactly. You have to go back to Oklahoma City to talk about a white act of terrorism.
Roger
right?
Dylan Roof.
Okay, so now you've managed to name 3 people, and I'm pretty sure Elliot Rodger wasn't explicitly white, by the way. But the thing is, you remember the names of white bombers and mass shooters, okay? Could you tell me the name of all 19 hijackers on 9/11 off the top of your head? You can remember Dylan Roof's name. You can remember Tim McVeigh's name.
People were capable of violence.
I didn't say capable. Of course we're capable. I'm carrying a pistol. I go to the gym all the time. I'm trying to make myself more capable of violence. I'm here to spread ideas, talk, in the hopes that somebody more capable will come along and do that. Somebody like Donald Trump, who does not give his daughter to a Jew.
So Donald Trump, but like more racist.
A lot more racist than Donald Trump. I don't think that you could feel about race the way I do and watch that Kushner bastard walk around with that beautiful girl, okay?
Can you talk a little bit about the right adopting the politics or the political style of the left?
We don't have the camaraderie, we don't have the trust level that our rivals do. And that camaraderie and trust is built up through activism, and that is one of the tactics that we're adopting.
Okay. I know that was a lot. Okay. I really want to point out two things. He, as a white nationalist, said himself, we are adopting the camaraderie and the trust of the activism that the other side has. That is the essence of a backlash to a multiracial coalition. We are determined to mimic the style of unity that these people have and use that against them, right? A lot of racism in what he said, a lot of anti-humanity in what it is that he spoke, right? They were watching though. They saw us. They saw the multiracial coalitions coming together. And it is heartbreaking to hear that. Now, that instance in Charlottesville is going to lead to one person dying the very next day at one of those rallies. A man from Ohio drove his car into a crowd of people and killed somebody. And he was a white nationalist. He was known as a white nationalist. Okay. Now, I want to talk about what brought them there. Okay. We talk about myths, and this is the biggest one that we have. The idea of the Great Replacement theory. Their claim is that it is immigration, especially, of non-white groups, is a part of a plot to replace white political power and culture in Western countries, especially here in the US, and that fuels these racist ideologies because it exploits the fear through misinformation and polarization. I have not seen an instance of an uprising of African Americans in this country trying to take hold of power, or a group of African Americans or Black people or minorities, for example, gathering at a place in Washington, D.C. to interrupt the proceedings of something, right? In the name of, hey, we need political power. We have not seen that to a great extent in this country. And I am more than happy to be wrong about that, but I have not seen that. So this idea that people are trying to replace them, that this idea of voter replacement, claiming that immigrants are going to reduce the political influence of white people. Now, here's a legitimate fact. We are only going to grow as a country. We are only going to get more diverse should we continue to be the country we've always been, made up of different ethnicities, backgrounds, creeds, colors, religions, all of that. So what is the true fear here? Now, the origins of this are going to come from the early 70s. The guy was a French writer, and he created this kind of dystopian, a dystopian situation where white people lost all of their power. And I'm certain that might be scary to people that might have been miseducated about the United States and its founding. But the term Great Replacement, this is going to be popularized in 2011. And it is going to spread like wildfire. And now we see this on full display, right? This used to be conspiracy theories that lived in the corners of the dark web and the internet. And now this is mainstream. You have people in current offices right now who still believe, who are firm believers in the Great Replacement theory. And the current president has made echoes of that in both his first and second term. I would also like to point out that both Steve Bannon, who used to be a confidant of the current president, as well as the current deputy chief of staff, Stephen Miller. He is known, and he has said things out loud that directly align with the Great Replacement theory, okay? And again, these are just facts of the moment, okay? Now, what are some of the violent instances that we've seen linked to the Great Replacement theory? Christchurch in 2019 in New Zealand, there was somebody that committed a mass shooting and killed about 50 people in the name of Great Replacement theory. A lot of the times in these manifestos, there is verbiage that is connected back to the Great Replacement theory, where these people have psyched themselves up to believe that they have to act and do something because they feel that their power is being taken away. In 2019, at the Walmart in El Paso, Texas, there are 23 people killed in a mass shooting because of the idea that these Hispanic folks in that region were taking over and taking things that belonged to the nationalists. And then the one that hits closer to home, in Buffalo, New York in 2022, 10 people were killed at Tops grocery store. Now, this was a Black town, and that young man had drove hours to this grocery store. And there were a lot of elder Black people in this situation that had gotten killed, right? Black people that probably had been through and seen enough racism and then were killed at the hands of an idea of a great replacement theory, this myth that power is being challenged in a way that's not fair, right? But again, if you were raised to think that this country is yours and yours alone, there's room to understand why these people would think that. And our jobs is going to be to present as many facts as we can, as much as we can, as often as we can, to whomever we can portray that message to fight back. And now I want to take you to some contemporary backlashes in 2025. I did not have fun putting these together because it's quite overwhelming, but this is what we are up against. But I know that if people couldn't and didn't give up to find their freedom and allow me to be able to talk about this today, then we have the opportunity to fight back. So this is more recent. The White House has a preferred alternative to PBS. Okay, my son is actually brokenhearted about the idea of PBS not having what they should because he's a PBS kid. He loves that. The idea is to replace that with a more right-wing network, PragerU. PragerU puts out videos that justify slavery. There's a video, an animation of Christopher Columbus on a ship with 2 young kids saying that slavery isn't that bad. It actually happens all across the world. So it's not that bad, downplaying the severity of these instances of American history. If you look up the founder of PragerU, he has used the words and kind of hinted at PragerU's purpose is to indoctrinate. I would love to have a discussion with anybody from PragerU to talk about, hey, why is it that this narrative is being created without the facts? In Oklahoma, social studies standards have been brought up. They have been changed, and they are now good to go. I've been looking at this story for quite some time. Their state superintendent is very, very close with the current president and talks about how they are going to revitalize these standards to the point where they talk about suggesting discrepancies in the 2020 election. Now, I guess that's okay, but who's going to be in charge of overseeing that? And if we are to separate education and politics, how does this fall in line with that? There's an exhibit that opened up at Stone Mountain in Georgia, where you have the Confederate, the huge Confederate monument on the side of the mountain. There's a new civil rights exhibit that was created to explain more of the story of enslavement as it relates to the Confederates that it pays homage to. Well, there was a lawsuit by the Sons of the Confederacy, okay, Sons of Confederate Veterans, excuse me, and they were suing because they felt that they were trying to taint the story of the Confederacy by bringing up civil rights. You cannot have that both ways. There is a town in Arkansas, I encourage you all to look this up, where they are building a whites-only settlement. And they have said out loud that they are creating this for themselves. If you don't get with us, then you got to stay out. If you don't have our same ideology, you stay out. That is a complete echo and rhyme when it comes to the idea of segregation and to what Dr. Geary said earlier, redlining, right? The separation of people to live. And if we go back to what James Baldwin said, segregation is bad because we don't learn enough about each other's story. A couple of years ago, Florida came out with this idea, and they too are going to start using PragerU's content. You have people in Florida that decided to come up with new standards and talk about slavery having benefits, and they stuck by that decision. Benefits to whom? At the very beginning of this current administration, there was an executive order that talked about ending wasteful government DEI programs and preferencing. All of what we've talked about is the exclusion of African Americans post-slavery, a fair shot at getting somewhere. But yet here we are with this subtle rollback, right? Think of this is 1965 where the Voting Rights Act comes to pass and things get a little bit better. And that's just 60 years ago. And here we are. You have Confederate names being restored to bases, to United States Army bases. It is the United States Army that defeated the Confederacy that stood for states' rights, and states' rights to do what? Continue and own slavery. And then just recently, you have the White House sending out a letter. I encourage you all to read the letter that was sent to the Smithsonian directors. And they want to make sure that what they are showing is in line with the vision that the current president has, starting with the African American Museum. Think about what it means if we throw around the word indoctrination. If they talk about all of these things that are so bad, why is it that the same rhetoric is not being used in terms of talking about slavery having benefits? Or we can't necessarily talk about all of the things that led to Stone Mountain and oh no, we can build our own towns because we don't like what's happening right now. This is damaging to the country. I still remain hopeful though, because I know that enough of us will come together eventually to put a stop to this, because it's not in the name of hate. We're not fighting back with hate. We're fighting back with facts, because our children are depending on us to give them a little bit better of a leg up than what we are going through now and what we should. So I'm going to pass it back to Dr. Geary to kind of go over some of the scenarios and kind of set us up for what we're going to talk about in session 3.
Thanks, Ivory. It is bleak seeing all of those headlines next to each other. It really is. It is overwhelming. But this is, yep, like you said, we're fighting back with facts. And as we'll talk about next week, it starts with the conversations that you have with friends, that you have with family, that you have with acquaintances, that you have with colleagues. And when you hear myths and misinformation being perpetuated, it starts with pushing back on those. And so we'll talk about that a lot more next week. We'll be in a different format where it won't be a webinar. It will be where we're able to see you and talk to you. So it's going to be a much more interactive session. So just to give you a bit of a heads up and a warning about that. But we're going to look at scenarios like these and think through how we can use history to respond and to push back in general ways that open up people to the possibility that they have internalized misinformation. So let's look at just a few scenarios here. So here's one about affirmative action and reverse racism. You're sitting with a friend, a white classmate named Jamie, after school. She just got rejected from a university when she's applying for schools. I had the grades, the scores, everything. I just know that someone took my spot because of their race. How is that fair? She leans in. It sure seems like affirmative action is just racism in reverse. Why should I lose out on something I earned just because I'm white? Here's a scenario about slavery being so long ago. You're at a family gathering. Your cousin Jesse, in their mid-30s, brings up a conversation you heard on the radio. I just don't get why people are still talking about slavery like it has anything to do with today. That ended so long ago. No one alive today owns slaves. How long are we supposed to keep blaming the past? Everyone has the same opportunities now if they work hard enough. He looks at you, expecting agreement. And we've got one more. You're on your lunch break at work when your coworker Ryan leans back in his chair and sighs. I swear, it's like being a straight white guy puts a target on your back now, he says. Every promotion, every training opportunity, they're all about diversity or representation. But no one cares if someone like me works hard or has experience. It's like we're the last group anyone's allowed to overlook, and we're supposed to just shut up about it. So we invite you to just kind of think through these in the interim from today until next week and think of ways you might respond if you were in these scenarios and talking to these individuals. And we also, what would be even better is if you know of scenarios in which someone has brought up myths or misinformation to you. If you can, if you wouldn't mind sharing those with us, with Ivory or myself, again, we'll pop our emails into the chat. We will turn your scenarios anonymously, or turn your anecdotes anonymously into scenarios, and we will workshop them with you. Because I have heard myths from people and have, in the moment, sometimes struggled with how exactly to respond. And so it's the purpose of this last session is to practice and practice together so that we can feel confident in speaking back to the perpetuation of misinformation. So we'll pop our emails in the chat now. And we've loved reading the chat, by the way. Ernestine and Jim, very much appreciate your comments and are very much in agreement with you. So there's mine. And with that, we'll end for today. We have a few more minutes. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to drop those in the chat or email us afterwards with any, feedback or thoughts. And we're happy to chat about anything.
Yes, and I just Miss Ernestine, I appreciate all of what you shared. I love that the truth will set us free. We will rise, and they cannot erase us, right? I think more of us have to have that type of what in whatever space you occupy, right? And we're hopeful that session 3 can get us there. But again, think about the things that we talked about, the intense backlashes that we've witnessed. Think about what you've learned about those backlashes or lack thereof. Where were you during these initial backlashes during the Obama administration where he was inaugurated and we saw the reverberation of this racism coming to pass again, right? Think about what could you do? Like I really want to challenge everyone's conscience. What else could I do? Even if it's engaging with somebody online. I engage with people online that disagree with me all the time and have very nasty things to say towards me. But I do it all in the name of humanity because that can't break me and it won't break me. So yeah, I appreciate you all showing up tonight. Any questions that you all have, throw those in the chat and we'll hang out here for a little bit.
Oh, thanks, Wendy.
Yeah, thank you for
Yeah.
what you
Thanks everybody for coming, spending these evenings with us.
we appreciate it.
Yay, Jim. Yes, please do send it.
Ooh, yes, more. 80 years old, I've been taught by my parents. I'm somebody knows my destiny but me. That's right. I know my history. I was nurtured by teachers who looked like me and parents who taught me that our people built this country. Where would I be if not for people of color in America? Yes, ma'am.
Where would any of us be? Absolutely.
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, thanks, Meg.
Keep your head up, Meg. Meg doing great work in Massachusetts. Brother-in-law took the time of lack of
opportunity. Linda, I'll copy this down, but please send us if you want any more details about it and we'll turn that into a scenario. That's a perfect example. And these are things that people hear all the time.
Yeah. And again, this is this is all in the name of humanity, right? We have got to do something to disrupt the negativity of the system. And it is up to us, right? If a white nationalist organization can come together in the name of seeing what progress looks like because of multiracial coalitions, we have the recipe. We just got to get in the kitchen, right? How about that?
I love it. Yes. Good.
Was that good?
It was like, yeah. Perfect.
All right.
All right, folks. I'm not seeing any questions, so I think we'll close out. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your evening. Thanks, Ivory. Thanks, Jordan, for helping us on the back end. And we'll hopefully see y'all next week.
All right.
Bye,
Bye.
folks.